Hello and welcome to Christian in Name Only. I am Reverend Kristen Worthen and I am joined by
Reverend Tim Schaefer.
And today we are talking all things protection in name only. We are going to talk about guns and gun control today. And so recognizing that this is a difficult conversation, if this is a conversation that will hurt your heart or that you have some trauma around, we want to name that, that's what we're talking about today. We're talking about violence. So if you need to skip this or if you need to come back to it later, we understand. But as we shift into protection in name only, let's hear what being able to protect ourselves sounds like.
On Twitter, a lot of the little Twitter trolls, they like to say, oh, Jesus didn't need an AR-15. How many AR-15s do you think Jesus would have had? Well, he didn't have enough to keep his government from killing him. So
I always say God and guns got us here, and God and guns will keep us here. Never surrender on the Second Amendment. Never give them an inch. I had a gun control group. I think they're called Moms Demand Action or something like that. Of course, it sounds pretty or something, right? Like moms are coming through the hall, demanding action. And then they said, well, we prayed before we come. We don't want to take away your Second Amendment. I said, well, you better go back and pray again because I'm a Christian and I believe in the biblical right of self-defense. And I said, if you want to pray about something, come back here in about a month and lobby to bring prayer and the Bible back in schools if you want to see change.
What should Christians think about gun control and the right to bear arms? That's the question before us in this good faith debate. And the answer is simple. Because Jesus Christ commands us to love our neighbors as ourselves, Christians have a moral duty to protect every person's right of existence and of self-defense, which includes the right to bear arms.
You heard there 3 clips. The first clip was, of course, Representative Lauren Boebert, who made the statement, Jesus didn't have enough AR-15s to keep his government from killing him. Completely anachronistic, of course, because guns, as we know them, did clearly not exist in the time of Jesus. The second clip was Pennsylvania State Representative Stephanie Borowitz saying, God and guns will keep us here. Never surrender on the Second Amendment. And then she goes on to say that she's a Christian and believes in the biblical right of self-defense. And she's telling members in the story of the group Moms Demand Action to come back and lobby to put prayer and the Bible back in schools if they want to see change. And then the third clip is from an organization called the Gospel Coalition, who has put out a series of videos of debates between pastors called Good Faith Debates. And in this particular clip, you see a pastor, Bob Thune, basically tying loving your neighbor to the Second Amendment. And he says, the answer is simple. Kristen, the answer is simple. Because Jesus Christ commands us to love our neighbors as ourselves, Christians have a moral duty to protect every person's right of existence and of self-defense, which includes the right to bear arms. So, Kristen, I wanted to get your thoughts on that. Any of what you heard there?
I've got like notes on notes on notes, right? I'm going to start with Bob Thune, because Jesus also said, like, there's this great scene in the gospel where the disciples come up to Jesus and these folks are like healing others from demons, but they're not doing it in Jesus' name, right? And the disciples come up to Jesus and they're like, hey, this is happening. We can stop it. You want to stop it? And Jesus is like, y'all chill, right? I know I'm taking some liberal license here, but Jesus basically tells them to chill. And here's what Jesus says. If they're not against us, they're for us. Bob Thune is starting from the premise that someone's against you, period. Like, his whole premise and foundation is that we have to defend ourselves because people are who's knocking down your door with a gun, man? Do criminals exist? Yes, but he sure is making it sound a lot more commonplace than it is. That's before you get to the scripture where the prophet Isaiah says God will judge between the nations. God will settle the disputes of the nations. And you know what will happen, Tim? They will beat their swords into plows, their spears into pruning tools. These weapons, these tools that deal death, will become agents of life, not because they are used to kill or to protect, but because they are turned into the things that feed people. I mean, come on, let's start there. Then you get into Borowitz and her complete dismissal of Mom's Demand Action. Like, does she understand? Has she read? Has she done the research to know how Mom's Demand Action got started? Does she know the stories of many of these mothers whose children's lives have been lost to gun violence? Because if those stories don't matter to her and she is saying that she's praying, maybe she's the one that needs to go back and pray again. Just maybe. And by the by, no one took prayer and the Bible out of school. I will say it again. I was an English teacher and I taught part of the Bible in one of my units. No one has taken it out. What they have taken away is your right as an authority figure to make it the sacred text that everyone must follow and give it any more authority than you would give Moby Dick inside a classroom. And no one has said those kids can't pray. You as a school cannot endorse a particular faith tradition's prayer. That's what is on the table and off the table. But those kids can pray, and those kids can bring their Bibles, and those kids can read their Bibles, and those kids can have clubs. I know. I was in one. I sponsored one. No one has taken their rights away. And Boebert's trivialization of the death and resurrection of Christ, a Christ she claims to follow, the language is abhorrent. And I think the language is abhorrent because I find so much of it rooted in violence itself. When we start bringing faith into the conversation about gun control, let's be clear. Jesus did not use violence for a reason. I don't know how in the world we can hold a Christ who surrenders everything he is, not only to his government, but to his faith tradition, killing him. This was a marriage of faith and government that killed Jesus. How do you hold a nonviolent Jesus in one hand and declare it's your right to defend yourself in the other?
One of the things that all three of those clips have in common, and we've talked about this before, how sometimes in these kind of ideological settings, the sort of this Christian nationalism where we're marrying our partisan rhetoric with our faith, we will read things that we believe into politically. We'll read those into our scriptures and say, this is what the scriptures say. And so just to be clear, I don't think this needs to be stated, but let me say it anyway. Guns did not exist in biblical times. So just on the face of it, to me, it seems utterly ridiculous to make a claim that the Bible somehow supports our Second Amendment right to bear arms, because the authors of the Bible could not have imagined guns as they exist today, or even guns as they existed when our Constitution was written. So we're talking about weapons by which to defend yourself. If that's what we are talking about, we're talking about what? Swords, knives, spears, bows, and arrows. We're not talking about these tools that are capable of mass casualties. That's the first thing I just want to say. The second thing that I find really intriguing, especially with two of those videos, is that there is apparently a claim that many Christians believe that the Bible gives you the right to defend yourself. And that may be, right? I mean, I think some of the references that I've kind of found as I was looking was, for example, there are some that claim that Exodus 22 is God authorizing a person to defend themselves against a thief. interpretation is a tricky thing, and I don't want to say that's a wrong interpretation, but the way I might interpret that is, well, there are these, this is under a heading called laws of restitution, which says that if someone steals an ox or a sheep and slaughters it or sells it, then there's going to be restitution that needs to be made. So I don't know that I would interpret it quite that same way. Or they might point to Jesus in Luke 11 talking about a strong man fully armed guarding his own home, protecting his belongings in essence. Okay, maybe, right? So maybe you have that right not to have your home violated, your goods taken from you, especially if those are necessities that you need to survive. But also, it's not clear that what is being said there is, well, you have the right to take the life of a person who does that wrong to you. It's a stretch, I think, to think that what is being said here or what is being argued is, well, if somebody breaks into your home, you have the right to shoot them and kill them and take their life, right? And so we have to also question, if there is a right to self-defense, what does that mean? And I think there's enough, as you have already pointed out, there's enough in the Bible as a whole, but also in the words of Jesus, I think in particular, and especially perhaps, that Jesus, turns the other cheek, that Jesus is a nonviolent person, that loving your neighbor for Jesus does not mean harming them, even if they wrong you. And so I'm a little suspicious of that claim, but I will say this is an instance where I'm not going to say that's a wrong interpretation or a right interpretation. I'm just going to say I disagree and have a different interpretation. And I think we might be able to reasonably disagree with that, because on that I'm not 100% convinced that you can find a really clear argument to be made one way or the other. But that would be my counterpoint to what this pastor is saying, and also to what this Pennsylvania state representative is claiming about the right to self-defense being in the Bible, and that extends to a protection of the Second Amendment and the right to bear arms.
Yeah. Well, if you're going to use scripture inside that argument, then let's make sure that we're clear. Love your neighbor as yourself. Jesus also says, greater love has no man than this, that he laid down his life for his friend, not kills others for his friend, not punches someone in the face for his friend. Greater love has no man than this, than that he lay down his life for his friend. That means that I step in front of it for my friend. It doesn't mean that I knock off the other person for my friend, right? Now, again, I'm with you. I'm not arguing no guns at all, although I'll be honest, personally, I don't like them. I grew up with them. I grew up around them. I know how to shoot them. I have a particular trauma as it comes around guns. My earliest gun memory is not of going out and traipsing around with a BB gun. My earliest real gun memory is that we had a situation that looked like it could have gotten dangerous in my house. And my father showed me where every single gun was and where all the bullets were, and took me out to learn how to shoot every single gun he owned, and taught me that when you shoot a gun, you aim, and you aim to kill. You don't aim to hurt. You don't aim to maim. You aim to kill. And I was young. And I love my dad. I'm not saying a word against my dad. I think he had my family's safety and best interest at heart. But that was traumatizing. And to this day, I do not like guns. And there are, I'm sure, a number of people who would say, be grateful. You had the protection if you needed it. I'm really not. That was terrifying. More terrifying, the thought of using it, than the thought of someone breaking into my house. Honestly, because on the other side of that bullet is a human life. On the other side of that bullet is someone's son or someone's daughter. And I know I cannot speak as someone who's been a victim of that kind of violence, but I can speak as someone who was very much told in a very real way that I may have to enact that kind of violence. And that was not a comfortable space to be in. I'm not saying don't go hunting. I've gone hunting. I'm not saying don't go skeet shooting. I'm saying that's not my preference of what I want to do, but I'm saying that violence feeds violence. the only real answer to violence is to starve it out. Quit answering violence with violence in our rhetoric and in our usage of weaponry.
I think you've touched on something really important too, which is there is a certain rhetoric around guns. And I think you hear it from gun owners also, who will say, you know what, if somebody breaks into my home and causes me or my family harm, I will protect them and I will shoot to kill. And then statistics show that if you are, unfortunately, in that situation, what will often happen is the person with the gun wanting to defend themselves will hesitate. And that gun will often be used then against you. And that statistically is true. And I think because there is this rhetoric and this self-assurance that I will be able to shoot and kill this person, because it's really trivializing human life. When you're then put into that position, you hesitate because I would argue that by and large, people are compassionate. And when you're faced with that actual choice in the moment, you hesitate because something doesn't feel quite right to you.
Yeah, that's the rhetoric that we see a lot here in Texas, right? I can't even get on the Nextdoor app anymore, right? Because of all the folks in the HOA where I used to live who would get on there and, someone's car got broken into. Well, not in my house. They wouldn't have gotten out of that alive. It's like, really? Is that what we're saying? Like, your car is worth more than someone's life. What's in your car is worth more than someone's life. Is that where we are? Our stuff is worth more than people's lives.
So what is it about the right to own a gun that makes that so special over other constitutionally protected things, rights, right to your own safety, right to practice your religion, right to say what you want to say, to speech, even if that speech is critical or if it is inconvenient. And one of the things I've noticed is that guns themselves have become idols. You talked earlier about, taking a life, and that people value their own property over the life of another human being. That in and of itself is really sad. And what item more than any has become an idol, something that is to be protected at all costs, but guns?
Mm. Yeah. Well, and I think too, even in our conversation, I'm noticing we're talking about like the right to own a gun. I'm not arguing that you don't have the right to own a gun. What I am arguing is I think that gun needs to be well regulated and controlled. You do not need the ability to slaughter 20 people inside 1 minute. You don't. Especially if your argument, as Borowitz and Thune and Boebert are trying to say, is a self-defense argument. You don't need 20 bullets. You need one.
Right. And I had brought up earlier that, right, our biblical authors could not have imagined guns, period. Also, the writers of our Constitution could not have imagined the types of guns that we have available to us today. They were talking about muskets that took minutes to reload after each shot. So it is really hard to say that what they're protecting is an AR-15. That seems really intellectually dishonest to make that claim. And I would agree with you. This is a right that is something that we have in this country. The Second Amendment protects a right to own a gun, but it does not necessarily lay out every type of gun, right? This is where I think the courts can step in and say, or Congress can step in and say, we don't think that these weapons of war are things that people should own, because other people have rights too. I think our rights only extend so far as they're not violating somebody else's right. And Kristen, you and I were talking earlier about how we regulate cars. We see that cars have the potential to become dangerous weapons. If I am intoxicated and I get behind the wheel of a car, I can hurt somebody. And so we have laws to protect against that. We have seatbelt laws. We've got airbag mandates, car seats for children. These are all to protect ourselves because we know that humans are fallible and will make mistakes. And when mistakes are made behind a tool that can cause death, we regulate those things. We try to mitigate those deaths and injuries. But then there's a group of people who will say, but not with guns. Those tools, those should not and cannot be regulated whatsoever to minimize harm to other people, to protect those rights, for example, the right to life.
Yeah. Well, and you have to have licensing to drive a car. There's a whole process you have to go through before you can get that license. And so my argument really is not no guns. I am saying there's got to be some regulation, right? Like, can we at least agree on some kind of universal background check? Can we at least agree on some kind of licensing being required? They've got to be secured. What happens if they're not secured? I have no problem with gun owners who did not properly store their guns and then lose their guns to theft. I have no problem with those gun owners, frankly, bearing some burden of responsibility for what happens afterward. Because if we're going to fiercely fight for the ability to own guns, then we also need to fiercely protect the guns and people from them.
For me, what I'm hearing in there also is, first of all, choice, right? This is a theme that we keep coming back to in many of our episodes. What I find fascinating here, two things I'm going to point out, especially in relation to our episode on abortion, is there's a group of people who will on one hand say they reserve the right to decide whether or not to own a gun, which absolutely I would agree is your right. But on the other hand, there are other rights that I'm going to say you don't have and I get to dictate to you, right, what you want. So your point is well taken that everybody has the right and everybody gets to make a different decision, the one that's right for them. I agree with that. Second thing that I will also say is it feels a little bit dishonest to me to be pushing, right? Because it's often the same people who will push for a pro-life agenda, but then not want to regulate weapons in the way that you're talking about, right? That maybe the type of weapon, the capacity of the ammunition, for example, or the firing rate of that weapon, or perhaps limiting it to people who don't have a history of violence, don't have current mental health concerns. So I do find it interesting that, again, the same group of people that will say abortion, no, we're protecting life. But when it comes to guns, no restrictions whatsoever. And well, okay, there may be a few people who have some mental health concerns or whatever, and they're going to kill a bunch of kids in a school. But that's kind of just the nature of having that right for available to everybody to own a gun. That seems really hypocritical to me.
Well, and there's so much else surrounding guns and gun safety and gun violence that needs to be addressed too, right? You brought up mental health, which I always get a little dicey when we talk about guns and mental health, because the last thing I want to do is stigmatize someone who every day gets out there and fights a war that I don't fight. And so folks who are really trying to care for their mental well-being, I always want to be more compassionate in my presence. And so when I start thinking about guns and mental health concerns, I get a little touchy on the language, but there are some public health concerns that we've got to think about, right? Not just mental health, but public health. Like gun violence is a public health issue. And we're failing to think of it in that sense, right? We're failing to think of the number of injuries, accidental and intentional, that come into our hospitals. We're so concerned with being able to keep this individual freedom. And listen, I'm here for individual freedom. I am. I like my freedom of speech. I like my freedom of religion. I like the ability to choose whether or not I can own a gun. I like all that. I dig that. And I understand that my individual liberties are guaranteed to me because I am in a social contract, that this is part of securing our communal life together, which means that when I think about my individual freedom, I also need to think about the ways in which my freedom is wielded to create flourishing for others or to deal death to others. And what we've lost in our conversations is the plot line that your individual rights are part of your navigating and stewarding a social contract that you are in. And so how are you thinking about yourself as part of, not separate from, the community?
Yeah, I agree. And I think, let me go back to mental health, right? Because I, as a person who struggled with my own mental health from time to time, as we all do, right? Because there is this stigma around mental health. And I think sometimes people feel like, oh, once you have a mental health concern, that is an ongoing thing. We don't think of it like a bodily illness, right? Like, I am sick, I'm going to go to the doctor, I'm going to get treatment, and then my body will get better, it will heal. We don't think about mental health in that same way. But there are moments in time when people struggle with mental health issues and probably ought not to have access to a gun. And I say that because the number one cause of gun deaths is suicide. And as somebody who struggled with suicidal ideation when I was younger, I can tell you right now that if my parents had had a gun that I could have easily accessed when I was a teenager, I would not be here today. Thank God they did not have a gun in the house. And for those who do, the statistics and studies will show that people will make a snap decision in the moment, and when the gun is not locked, when the bullets are not stored away from that gun, anything that delays your access to that gun, if you have access to a gun, increases the likelihood that you will not go through with that suicidal attempt. And so, yes, there are people who, when they have, for example, mental health concerns like depression, and a mental health professional might deem you to be a threat to yourself, I think it is within our right, or it is within sort of this construct of the common good to take that gun out of the situation until that person is healthier again, where they're no longer a threat to themselves or a threat to others. And so how that ties into what you were just saying about the common good and thinking about our rights kind of communally is we need to have a conversation about what we fund. We have a tendency to say, let's throw a ton of money, right? My city right now, we're having a budget crisis. Guess what? Our number one expenditure is by far in our city's budget. It is police, because we rely so much on policing because we think police somehow prevent crime. In reality, we ought to be investing for the sake of our communities in things that will prevent crime, right? Crime prevention. And I'm talking about things like taking the stigma out of mental health concerns and investing in mental health resources, investing in violence prevention programs, because intimate partner violence is also a huge cause of gun violence and deaths. Why are we not taking some of those funds from the people who respond to the crimes in the aftermath of a crime? Why are we not investing some of that money instead in prevention of crimes, true prevention?
Sure. My police department doesn't need a tank. But you know what they do need? To be able to respond to fewer calls.
That is, I would agree with that. And we're getting into a whole other topic that we probably ought to discuss in a different podcast episode.
I know. Absolutely. Absolutely. I'll add too, thank you for your candid response about mental health and well-being, because I have loved ones that they'll be honest enough to say the reason that they don't own a gun is because they struggle mightily with depression still. And so you're exactly right. Anything we can do to create a pause for someone in the middle of a mental health crisis, we want to do, which is one of those reasons that when we talk about gun control and gun safety, we have got to think about and talk about actually having universal background checks, that you can't just walk into a gun show and get a gun. You can't just walk into a pawn shop and get a gun. You can't just go get a gun with no pause in between the I want to purchase this and now I can use it. Right? Because that pause can literally mean a life, if not multiple lives.
Well said. I want to, in the few minutes that we have left as we're wrapping up, tie this to Christian nationalism, because I strategically picked those clips from earlier in the episode, because they are tying God and guns together, or in Lauren Boebert's case, Jesus and AR-15s. And I recognize that there is a way that some who I would say are Christian nationalists take their very partisan beliefs, they wrap it in the Bible, they wrap it in their faith, they wrap it up in their God, and they use very deliberately that language of God and guns. And let's talk a little bit about how we as Christians maybe ought to think about the issue of guns, maybe a little bit separate from our faith, or at least with, as you've articulated really well in previous episodes, that letting our faith values guide our position, as opposed to this tight merging that we heard in those clips. And so how might Christians respond to this issue in that more nuanced way?
Sure. So when I think about the overarching story of Scripture, I think about when God calls Abram and names him Abraham and says, I'm going to bless you. I'm going to bless you to be a blessing. That is what you're called to do. And over again, when God is dealing with Israel and God is dealing with God's people, the invitation and the call for them is to be a blessing, to bless others, to show them that life can be lived differently outside of these systems of violence, outside of these systems of oppression, outside of these systems where my success demands your death or your marginalization. Over and over, the pattern of Scripture is, I'm calling you, but I am not calling you for you. I'm calling you for everyone else around you. So be a blessing. And I am not sure we can be a blessing while refusing to hold the sacred stories of mothers who have lost children. I'm not sure we can be a blessing when we insist on a nation or a school or a community living and doing things my way because I say so. Ultimately, I do believe God is about building God's kingdom on earth as in heaven. But I also ultimately believe that God is not doing that through coercion. God is doing it through persuasion. And people are not persuaded when they are being compelled. And that is why Jesus didn't break out an AR-15 when they nailed him to a cross.
Not to mention that they didn't exist, but sure.
To your point.
You were speaking metaphorically, of course. I understood that, but I had to get that in there. And I hear what you're saying, and I 100% agree. And I will say, maybe add one thing, and I don't think this is an additional point. I think it is reinforcing what you've said, which is, I know I hear people struggle, especially with the what they would call the God of our Hebrew scriptures, right, or of the Old Testament. Some people would refer to it as, because there are some instances of anger, God's anger, right? God's angry, God is seeking retribution. But one of the things that strikes me as interesting is God is often, if not almost always or always, doing that because God's people have been harmed. There's this protective kind of quality about that, right? This retribution even.
Or God's people are doing harm.
Or God's people are doing harm, and there's punishment for doing harm, right? So harm is against people, especially against innocent people, seems to often be God's motivation in that. And so then I have to wonder, is that the kind of anger that could be expressed also, that God would seek almost retribution for the killing of innocent children in a classroom in a mass shooting, right? And so is there a righteous anger? I know we feel it. I feel it. Many people feel that righteous anger. And I would argue that I know our faith often teaches us anger is not an appropriate response. I would disagree with that. God gets angry. Jesus gets angry and flips over tables at injustice, right? I think if injustice moves us to the point of anger, I think that is biblical. I think how we channel that anger, how we use that anger, that is really important for us as Christians to consider.
Yeah, well, and we see that, right? Like we see prophets getting angry and uttering these prophecies out of their anger. We also see prophets getting angry and like pouting because they don't get their way, right? And so I think we see examples in Scripture of appropriate ways of navigating our anger, speaking truth to power, and inappropriate ways of navigating our anger, like sitting under a broom tree and just wishing to be gone and pouting our way through it. We see that. We see a God in the book of Job who's big enough to hold our anger, right? Like Job gets pretty ticked off at God, and God's response is this is another topic too. God's response is not exactly fulfilling either. But you know what Job does teach us is that God can handle our anger. And that whatever the thing is we need to say, we can say it to God. We may not like God's response. God's response may not be satisfactory, but God can hold our anger. And I think, to your question, like what can Christians do about this? I think that if I'm a Christian and I'm a gun owner, I can have properly in my mind why it is that I own this weapon, right? Am I a hunter? Do I shoot as a hobby? Do I just go skeet shoot? Is it for self-protection? And in what instance would I be willing to pull that out? Right? Like I can have my values at the fore and remind myself regularly of what those values are. I can also practice safety and remember that there are others in my house, that I could have kids or grandkids in my house. And so how accessible are these guns to them? Like I can practice personal safety and responsibility. There's also, again, how am I valuing the community when I think about the rules and the regulations around gun ownership? What kind of right to a weapon am I actually guaranteed? Like what actually makes logical, common sense? And if there is not an instance that is not apocalyptic in nature, in which I will need a military grade weapon, then maybe the answer is I don't need a military grade weapon. And I could get on board with some common sense regulations.
Kristen, thanks again for the really important conversation. Thank you for being my conversation partner. I appreciate it. For all of you who are listening, we invite you to get involved in the conversation. Engage with us on social media, ask questions, give your perspectives, because this is always a conversation between two of us. And we know that there are just as many opinions as there are people involved in a conversation. And so we want to hear from you. We want you to engage with us. And we want you to feel free to also suggest some topics that you might want to hear us talk about in the future.
Thanks for being part of the Christian in Name Only community. As much as we love the sound of our own voices, we'd love to hear yours even more. So remember to like, subscribe, share, and comment on the pod, sign up for our emails, and let's continue the conversation together.